Cher is 79 years old. She has been through more than most people will face in 3 lifetimes. She grew up poor. Not the romanticized kind of poor that makes for a tidy backstory. The real kind, where her mother sometimes couldn't put food on the table. She spent her childhood moving from city to city, apartment to apartment, always one step behind stability. Her father was an addict who was mostly absent. Her mother was beautiful, restless, and married 8 times, not out of weakness, but out of desperation to survive in a world that made it very hard for a woman to do that alone. Cher was dark, unusual looking, half Armenian in classrooms full of kids who didn't know what Armenian was. She had dyslexia before anyone knew to call it that. She struggled to read when reading came easily to other kids. She was different, and the world let her know it. She decided at 9 years old that she was going to be famous. At 16, she dropped out of school and moved to Los Angeles with $20 and a suitcase. No plan, just this absolute certainty that she was supposed to be somewhere bigger than where she'd started. That's where she met Sonny Bono. He was 26. She was 16. He worked for Phil Spector, and he saw something in her immediately. Not just how she looked, but something harder to define. A stubbornness. A refusal to be made small. He believed in her before anyone else did, and that part is real and worth saying. But he also, in the way men of that era often did with young women they loved, began shaping her into the version of herself he wanted. By the time she understood what that meant, she was 18, married, and every dollar she earned passed through his hands first. Every song needed his approval. Every interview, every appearance, every decision, all of it filtered through Sonny Bono before it reached the world. 50 million people watched the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour every week at its peak. 50 million people watching a woman be funny and alive and completely herself. With no idea, she had almost no legal control over any of it. She filed for divorce in 1975. Sonny told her she was nothing without him, that the world loved Sonny and Cher, not Cher alone, and she'd figure that out the hard way. She found out the opposite, but not quickly and not without real difficulty. The years after the divorce were hard in ways the eventual success tends to erase. The solo career stumbled. Television specials underperformed. Hollywood didn't want her. They saw a pop star, a TV personality, someone famous in the way that word gets used to dismiss people rather than describe them. One producer told her she wasn't believable as a real person on screen. She kept going anyway. Theater in New York. Small roles. She studied. Come back to the Five and Dime. Jimmy Dean in 1982. Silkwood in 1983 opposite Meryl Streep. A Golden Globe nomination. The industry started paying attention. Mask in 1985. Moonstruck in 1987. April 11, 1988. Academy Award for Best Actress. She was 41. She stood at the podium in a Bob Mackie gown that made the room gasp and said she didn't think this was a very important moment. She was wrong about that. But what she meant, and couldn't quite say out loud, was that the real victory had already happened years earlier, in all the auditions that went nowhere, all the doors that closed, all the voices that told her to stop. The Oscar was just the receipt. And then her body broke down. In the early 1990s, right at the moment when everything seemed settled, the fatigue started. Not tiredness from overwork, the kind that lives in your bones and doesn't lift no matter how much you sleep. Then the pain. Muscle aches that moved around without logic. Headaches that arrived without warning and stayed for days. A fog over her thinking that made concentration feel like trying to see through frosted glass. She pushed through it for months the way she'd always pushed through things, by refusing to admit something was wrong. But the body doesn't negotiate with willpower forever. She was eventually diagnosed with Epstein-Barr virus, a condition that conventional medicine in that era was only beginning to understand. There was a name for it, but no cure. She canceled tours, withdrew from public life. The tabloids filled the silence with gossip and speculation about her appearance, her relationships, her relevance. None of it was true. The truth was a woman lying in a darkened room, unable to perform, unable to be the thing she'd built her whole identity around being. And while all of that was happening, her son Elijah was growing up. Elijah Blue Allman was born in 1976, the son of Cher and Greg Allman, the rock musician whose own struggle with addiction was as well documented as his talent. Elijah grew up in the middle of extraordinary privilege and extraordinary dysfunction at the same time. He was sensitive, creative. He had his mother's intensity and his father's pull toward darkness. He also grew up watching Cher survive everything. And no one stopped to consider what that does to a child, to watch your mother absorb blow after blow and rise each time, composed, unstoppable, apparently invincible. It doesn't always inspire. Sometimes it just isolates. Sometimes it teaches a child without anyone meaning to that pain is something you perform through, that vulnerability is private, that the way you handle difficulty is by not letting anyone see how difficult it is. Elijah learned the family language of survival. He just didn't have the same armor. And when substances found him in adolescence, they offered something the armor never could: numbness without effort, relief without performance. The cost, as it always does, came later. In September 2023, Cher filed a petition in Los Angeles to become Elijah's legal conservator. Elijah hired a legal team and fought it. He appeared in court and disputed his mother's characterization of his condition. He was, by every legal definition, a competent adult asserting his right to make his own choices. The law, which exists to protect exactly that right, took his side seriously. The case dragged through the courts. Every filing became a headline, a famous name, a family in crisis, exactly the kind of story that performs well online and tells you almost nothing real. What none of the headlines captured was what Cher was actually living. She was 77 when she filed that petition, 78 as the case continued. She'd spent years and millions on treatment programs. She'd flown across the country on desperate parental missions that didn't make the news because they ended not in rescue, but in another closed door. She'd loved him every way she knew how to love, which in her case means fiercely, completely, and without the ability to just stop. By 2024, those closest to her were quietly concerned about her own health. The years were accumulating in ways that even Cher's constitution couldn't entirely absorb. She was still fighting. Not for a clean ending. Not for the story that resolves into triumph. She was fighting for the version that every parent of an addicted child knows. The one where love isn't enough, and money isn't enough, and fame isn't enough, and you keep going anyway because the only other option is to stop. And stopping is the one thing she has never learned to do. This is where her real story lives. Not in the Oscar, not in the arena tours, not on the magazine covers at 50 and 60 and 70 that made everyone feel like she existed outside normal human rules. It lives here, in a courtroom where she's not an icon but a mother, in a legal petition that might not work, in a love that doesn't photograph well and doesn't win awards and doesn't resolve into anything anyone can easily celebrate. People have asked her, in 1,000 interviews across 6 decades, some version of the same question. How do you keep going? She's answered it with a joke, with a raised eyebrow, with whatever deflection keeps the real answer private. But the real answer has been visible the whole time. She keeps going because she never believed stopping was an option. Not when her mother couldn't feed her. Not when Sonny said she was nothing alone. Not when Hollywood wouldn't return her calls. Not when her body gave out in the 90s. Not when Sonny died in 1998, which broke something in her she's never fully described publicly, because he was complicated, and her grief about him was complicated, and some losses resist explanation. Not now either. At 79, she knows exactly what love can and cannot do. She knows she can't reach inside her son and change what's happening to him. She knows the court might not rule in her favor. She knows none of this comes with a guarantee. She's fighting anyway. Because at 9 years old, In a childhood that offered her almost nothing, she told her mother she was going to be famous. And somewhere in that same girl, the one who showed up in Los Angeles with $20 and no map, stopping was simply never a language she learned. At 79, with everything on the line, she's still speaking the only language she's ever known. She's still here,